Welcome to Fox Soul's Black Report with our continued coverage of the Derek Chauvin murder trial. I'm Romeo.
Hey there, I'm Brooke.
I'm Demi.
I'm Melissa.
On today's report, our legal expert, civil rights attorney Sue Ann Robinson is back to help us recap today's proceedings. And we have your justice for George Floyd trending headlines.
Plus, today we're sitting down with Jakari Harris and Adrianette Williams from the George Floyd Memorial Foundation.
Drug addiction has been a topic of questions during the Derek Chauvin trial, and with the news of DMX suffering a possible drug overdose, we're also going to discuss addiction, recovery, and support with sober advocate Brandon Chastain.
Yes, we are. We have all that and so much more. So if you're ready, it's our voice and our truth. Let's get it.
To me, this reeks of conflict of interest.
Do we know if he actually waved a gun? We only hear one side of the story.
This just really did make me feel good that the justice system did what they needed to.
We're going to keep following this story, and we will have the latest for you. Hey, Soulmates, today is day 6 of the trial of former Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin. He's charged with murder and manslaughter in the death of George Floyd. Today, the Minneapolis police chief testified Chauvin violated department policy in pressing his knee on Floyd's neck and keeping him down after Floyd stopped resisting. Chief Madera Arendaro says the act was, quote, in no way, shape, or form, end quote, part of department policy or training. He also testified, quote, it is certainly not part of our ethics or our values, end quote there as well. Another witness, Dr. Bradford Langenfeld, was a senior resident on duty last May at Hennepin County Medical Center. He tried to resuscitate Floyd and testified he believes a lack of oxygen stopped Floyd's heart. Prosecutors wanted that to establish it was Chauvin's knee that caused the lack of oxygen. The defense sought to push back against that framing. Officer Kate Blackwell also took the stand to talk about the officer's use of force. She spent most of her time on the witness stand answering questions about the department's training protocols. Demi.
Here to give us an update on the Derek Chauvin trial is legal expert and civil rights attorney Sue Ann Robinson.
Hey guys.
Welcome back. It's so great to see you, even though we have this wall between us now. It was so great to have you here in person last week. But I just want to ask you, so you're going to be headed to Minneapolis very soon, but you already have your colleagues and teammates on the ground ready to go right now. Can you tell us what the mood is like? Have they told you anything about what's happening in Minneapolis?
Yeah, the mood right now is, quiet, somber, very tense around the courthouse. There's only 33 people allowed in the courtroom at any given time, including the jurors. So there's not much hustle and bustle happening inside the courtroom. The judge actually removed a chair today because Chauvin has not been exercising his right to have one person, family member present. So they removed a chair. So there's less than 33 people in there at the moment. But it's just somber, very tense. Everybody is laser focused on what's happening. I mean, George Floyd Square is ground zero for an international movement, a very important one, and it's an occupational protest. A lot of people don't realize that, where everyone's putting the pictures and the teddy bears and the barricades near Cup Foods. That is a protest. That's an ongoing protest. That's not an actual building. That's not anything that's supposed to be there. That is something that was put there by the protesters in the city, at this time is allowing to maintain, to represent, the city's demands, what the citizens are demanding in terms of justice for George Floyd. So a very tense, somber, laser focused air there right now.
Sue Ann, this morning's proceedings started with the defense requesting certain amendments being made. One with a Schwartz hearing involving possible jury misconduct. Can you explain to our soulmates what that means and exactly what happened?
Okay, well, a Schwartz hearing is when there is an allegation that an outside influence could have a prejudicial effect on the juror. So it could be anything. If you listen to Judge Cahill at the end, whenever they go out, he says, don't watch any media and don't talk to anybody about the case. That's their 2 instructions. That's how they're being sequestered right now. They're not physically sequestered, but they're not permitted to do those 2 things. So if there was an allegation made that one of the jurors saw something, read something, heard something, then that would lead to that kind of hearing. The judge would make inquiry to find out whether or not it had a prejudicial effect. The juror would potentially answer the questions to a way that satisfies the judge. So basically what happened, Cahill questioned the jurors involved and he found that there wasn't a violation.
Okay. Civil rights attorney Sue Ann Robinson joining us today. We truly appreciate you taking out the time once again. But let me ask you this. Dr. Bradford Langenfeld was called to the witness stand today. He was a doctor who treated George Floyd after he arrived motionless and without a full pulse to a Minneapolis hospital. Let's take a look at some of his testimony.
How long was Mr. Floyd in your care in the emergency department?
Approximately 30 minutes.
And at the end of the 30 minutes, did you pronounce him formally dead?
Yes.
At the time you pronounced him dead, was he still in some degree in PEA or asystole in terms of describing his heart?
I think it's probably best to think of these as sort of a spectrum where PEA is some degree of electrical activity still running through the heart, but the heart's not pumping. And then eventually that will devolve into asystole, where both the heart is not pumping and then the electrical activity stops as well. And so at the end of the case, Mr. Floyd was still in PEA, but there was virtually no cardiac activity. And at that point, in the absence of any apparent reversible cause, and because Mr. Floyd had been in arrest for, by this time, 60 minutes, I determined that the likelihood of any meaningful outcome was far below 1%, and that we would not be able to resuscitate Mr. Floyd, and so I then pronounced him dead.
And doctor, was your leading theory then for the cause of Mr. Floyd's cardiac arrest oxygen deficiency?
That was one of the more likely possibilities. I felt that at the time, based on the information I had, it was more likely than the other possibilities.
And doctor, is there another name for death by oxygen deficiency?
Asphyxia is a commonly understood term.
Thank you, Dr. Langenfeld. No further questions.
Okay, Sue Ann, what are your thoughts about his testimony?
My thoughts are, it wasn't a very sexy testimony. I'm sure when the jury heard that they were going to hear testimony from an ER doctor, they were picturing, McDreamy, because that's the juror's frame of reference for doctors. This doctor is very simple, very basic, very technical, using technical terms and just kind of giving the facts. He does foreclose the idea of George Floyd's death being due to previous medical conditions, but he kind of cushions it by saying it's more likely that it was asphyxia than it was not. So he doesn't give you that clear 1-2 punch, but all the prosecution needs is for it to be in evidence so they can make the argument to the jury later.
Sue Ann, I want to move on to Chief Madera Arradondo. Demi's going to talk about his testimony overall because he touched on a wide array of things, right, during his testimony. But I want to talk about something specific. There's been a lot of focus on one very point of department policy, right? The use of force. But the chief was willing to testify that Derek Chauvin violated multiple different department policies. And I'm curious on your thoughts on the weight you think this could hold to our jury and maybe also people in the entire city overall.
Yeah, I think the chief coming out and saying, listen, this is wrong on multiple levels. We did not sanction this. This is not how we do things. It's not approved. Everything he did was against policy. Goes into kind of the rogue officer kind of land with respect to how he's behaving, because they're disassociating from the behavior, from the way that he handled the entire case, from everything that Chauvin is doing. The MPD is disassociating. And so that's good because we all think that what happened was wrong. So the root and where they have to get with it, the prosecution needs to get, is this is so beyond what any officer would do, even a reasonable one, because that's the standard.
So, Sue Ann, we heard a lot today from the police chief, Madera Arradondo. So can you just tell us, like, your overall thoughts of his testimony?
I thought his testimony, again, it wasn't super fun, but it was very technical. The way that the prosecution is running their case, they are boxing in the defense. They are coming for their medical argument slowly but surely on one side. On the other side, they're coming for their this was my training. This is a policy. I'm a police officer. This is what we all do. They're boxing in the defense, and which each and every witness, it's diminishing their arguments. So I think they're doing an excellent job. I think overall, the chief's testimony, the highest police officer in the county saying that this was against policy, it's not sanctioned, it wasn't appropriate, is really damaging to Chauvin's case.
The judge ruled that a police officer's testimony was cumulative evidence. You had some interesting thoughts about that. Can you elaborate?
Oh, yes. The judge ruled earlier in the morning that the prosecution was not going to be permitted to keep asking every police officer that comes on the stand whether or not what Derek Chauvin did was reasonable. They're not going to be permitted to elicit that testimony from any other police officer witnesses. The judge ruled that that would be cumulative evidence. And I don't know what more. That's like if you're in a boxing match and the ref has to step in because you're just hitting them too much. The judge is like, listen, it's too much. It's cumulative. We got it. What he did was unreasonable. You don't need to elicit it from another witness. So I find that extremely interesting that Cahill is doing what he's supposed to do. He's the ref. The jury is the judge of the facts. So he's stepping in and he's saying, hey, guys, they're starting to bleed. Let them go to their corner.
So we also heard from Katie Blackwell as well. What were your thoughts on her testimony?
Katie Blackwell gave me life today. Let me find the quote. I'm going to put it in my words, but she basically said, I don't know what kind of improvised position that is. I added in the I don't, because I felt that her whole attitude was like, listen, I'm the trainer. I do the training. I've known this guy for 20 years. I don't know what he's doing. Like, what's happening here? So her whole vibe was very formal. You know, I'm a training officer. I've been at this for a long time. And this is nothing that I've ever seen anyone do, spoke of, don't know where he got that from. He's on his own. Again, it's with the theme of MPD disassociating themselves from everything that Derek Chauvin did. So Katie Blackwell definitely came in on the prosecution side of squeezing in the defense's argument that what Chauvin is reasonable for a police officer or based on some training or based on a policy. They're squeezing the defense in and away from those arguments.
So, Ann, what stood out most for you today?
I definitely feel like Katie Blackwell stood out for me. Obviously,
Really?
It's absolutely unprecedented for the chief of police to testify. So certainly that was something that had me, glued to the screen. I wanted to hear every word. I felt like a lot of his testimony too is something that would have been offered had we had to have a civil trial. Him being, talking a lot about policies, taking out the policy book, which, I'm sure wasn't super fun for the jury, but it's necessary because I was explaining before what the prosecution is doing. They're masterful kind of boxing in the defense. They also have to get the witnesses to say certain things that go with their own arguments that they're going to make later on in their closing arguments. So if they don't elicit that testimony, they can't tie it up later in closing. And so a lot of the things, the little tidbits and technical information that the chief gave will help them in closing. And it also represented a win for the culture because I feel like the MPD is also on trial in this case because they don't have the best reputation. So this is their opportunity to redeem themselves and say, hey, this is what we're about. This is what our policies are. And this is what we're going to give you going forward.
I got to ask you this, Sue Ann. We all saw what happened on that tape. We saw that Derek Chauvin murdered George Floyd. We know the jury has to make their decision as well. My question is, when the witnesses come up, they nail it home. They bring it home, the facts of what happened that day. So when the defense lawyer gets up there, I feel like he does a lot of rambling, right? So he never really gets to a good point. Maybe he doesn't have a point. But how do you think the jury feels when he gets up there, knowing that he's not really driving any facts home?
Okay, I think that the defense is on the defense. So
Right.
they're in the prosecution's case in chief. There's not much for them to do. It's like they're on the prosecution's home court and just doing their best to kind of, chip away at any points they made where they can. But this is not their case in chief. And I want everyone at home, the soulmates, to keep in mind, trial has ups and downs for both sides. Right now we're up. And that's good. The prosecution is doing a masterful job. They're making their points. The officers are saying what he did was unreasonable, but there's going to come a point in the defense case where we're not going to be at a high. They're going to elicit facts about George Floyd with their horrible, stereotypical, victim shaming, victim blaming defense. And it's going to be a down day for all of us. So just keep that in mind. There's going to be highs and lows. We're definitely into day 6 now, and we're still on a high because the prosecution is demonstrating that they know how to squeeze the defense and squeeze down their arguments.
So I'm really curious about this because I thought it was very fascinating. Well, not fascinating, but interesting that Derek Chauvin decided not to have a family member come to trial with him. He only has one. I was very curious to know your thoughts. Whose idea do you think that was? Was it the lawyer? Do you think the family members don't want to be associated with him? Do you think he said not to have a family member for safety? Like, what are your thoughts on why nobody came to support him in court?
Yeah, I think it's very difficult, if you're there to be supportive of Derek Chauvin outside of the defense team. Everybody looks at the defense team and they're like, they're just doing their job. They're doing what they have to do. That's what they're hired to do to protect his constitutional rights. But I think if there were actual family members or friends there, which who knows if he has any, because remember, he got divorced very, very quickly after George Floyd passed away. So his wife, he was like, I'm out. So we don't know, what his actual family situation is. I think it's very telling that in his depths, he has no one there. He would prefer that. And it could be for safety reasons, or it could be because nobody wants to rock with him like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was curious, but thank you so much. That was a great answer. I always like to ask you things that's in my head, but I feel like, you give a good perspective on it. Thank you so much, Sue Ann, for checking in. I believe we're going to have you on tomorrow as well, too.